All right. Welcome to the third course in the John David Ebert School for the Study of Culture, Cosmology, and the Arts on the history of German idealism. We've already done transformations of consciousness through time, and then we followed that with a course on understanding mythology, which we just completed last weekend, all 10 classes of that. And so now we will be starting 8 classes on the history of German idealism, which will go through Immanuel Kant, Fichte, Schelling and Hegel, and then finally with Arthur Schopenhauer. And I want to do this course, these 8 weeks, as a kind of prologue to an 8-week class on Friedrich Nietzsche that I want to follow that with, which will be a lot of fun, I think. All right, so now in order to understand, I think, we could start with Kant directly if we wanted to. The Critique of Pure Reason, the first draft of it was put out in 1781. We could start with that, but I think it's important to go take an introductory video lecture first and go back over the debate between the rationalists and the empiricists, although I do want to glance back first at St. Thomas Aquinas and some of his ideas. I have him up here on Wikipedia. Thomas Aquinas lived in the 13th century. 1225 to 1274, and his major work is known as the Summa Theologica, and it's written at the end of during the last decade of his life, from about 1265 to 1274, and in it, Aquinas now, and so the reason I want to go back and start with Aquinas is because if we just start with Descartes, who in the 17th century, in the late 1630s, early 1640s, is generally regarded by philosophers as the father of modern philosophy. Descartes begins with a sweeping gesture of his hand saying, "What if everything I believe or think I know is false?" So I think it's important, and he's rejecting the scholastics and rejecting the Jesuits and rejecting the Aristotelians. I think it's important to know a little bit about scholasticism first, so that we can understand Descartes in a better context. And Thomas Aquinas is regarded as the apotheosis of all the scholastics, so he's the one that you would want to really try to understand. So Aquinas makes a distinction. So this is the age of Aristotle now. The texts of Aristotle, this is the 13th century, have been recovered from the Arabs, but not yet the texts of Plato. I think only the Timaeus might have been floating around, but not much else until the Renaissance, until the 15th century, when in 1453, with the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans, then we got all kinds of texts, Greek texts, that went west to Florence and places like that, when the Greek monks fled carrying armloads full of scrolls, the texts of Plato, the Corpus Hermeticum, and all kinds of good stuff, Plotinus. And so Aquinas then begins with, so that his whole thing is trying to reconcile faith with reason. That is to say, the scriptures with Aristotle. And even in this picture here, you can see he's holding the church in his right hand and holding scripture in his left hand. The left note is associated always with the inferior side. So so the scriptures here are inferior to the church and to the authority of the church. But Aquinas will say that philosophy is not enough for the philosopher. The philosopher can educe proofs for the existence of God if he so wants, but ultimately philosophy requires revelation for completeness, and only such truths such as the Trinity can be understood through revelation and through the authority of the church. So that the revelation of the fact that the world was created not eternally, but in time, that there was a definite creation event, as the book of Genesis says, all of this is backed up by the authority of the church, which the philosopher cannot gainsay. All the philosopher can do is to work with his concepts, to work on truth in the natural order. And it must be said that Aquinas is a bit of an empiricist in a certain way. He did not believe in innate ideas, and the possession of innate ideas is what marks the rationalist, such as Descartes or Spinoza or Leibniz, in opposition to the empiricist who denies them, such as John Locke, George Berkeley, or David Hume. And that is the debate that Kant will try to resolve. But even going back to Aquinas, he perhaps surprisingly, perhaps not. After all, he's working under the shadow of Aristotle, not Plato. He begins with the concrete world, the physical world, and all our ideas, according to Aquinas, come from the senses. And the extraction from what he calls these phantasms of the senses by the intellect, which pulls out the intelligible species, or in other words, the forms, the ideas. So that's the thing. So philosophy requires revelation. It's incomplete without it. And he proceeds then so he begins with God, just as Descartes will begin not with God, but with the self, and he will move from proving the reality of the self to proving the reality of God, then to proving the reality of the external world. Whereas Aquinas begins with God, as does Spinoza, begins with God and gives us 5 proofs for God's existence. He sweeps aside Anselm's ontological argument as being a priori and analytically true, namely the fact that God exists, because the predicate existence is a perfection. And God contains, by definition, all perfections. Therefore, God contains the perfection of existence. Therefore, God exists, QED. That's the ontological argument for the existence of God. But Aquinas sweeps that aside and, consistent with his empiricism, deals with the concrete physical world, the world of physicality and the physical plane, starting with the argument for a first cause. It's evident that causality is what moves things along in the world. Each thing that happens, we assume, must have had a cause that made it happen, and so on backwards, and there would be an infinite regress if we did not stop at a first cause. So there must have been a first cause, therefore God exists, QED. The second argument is very much like the first, the argument from motion, that there must have been a first mover. Since everything is in motion, there must have been an unmoved mover, which of course Aquinas borrows from Aristotle. There must have been an unmoved mover at the beginning of all this that set everything in motion. The third argument is the argument from contingency and necessity. Everything and everyone is contingent on something else for its existence. Only God exists necessarily. There's nothing contingent about his existence. And so everything depends on something else for its existence. And so ultimately we have to say, well, that there must be a God who is not contingent on anyone or anything, and upon which all created things are contingent. So that's the third argument. The fourth argument has to do with perfection. It has to do when we say that one thing is better than another, whether it's a work of art, whether it's a cathedral, what have you, whatever it is. This person is better than that person. This person's a reprobate. That person is not. The argument from perfection leads back again to God as the ultimate perfection, from whence all other imperfect perfections, let's say, can be derived. So those are the four main arguments, and then finally the fifth argument is the argument, what would be regarded as the teleological argument, namely that when one looks at the order and beauty and harmony of the world, it looks like it was designed by a craftsman, by an artist. It looks like it was thought out. And of course that craftsman artist is God. And so that, in a nutshell, is basically Thomas Aquinas' 5 ideas, or 5 proofs rather, for the existence of God. And he completely leaves out the ontological argument, which later philosophers such as Descartes and Spinoza will not, and also Leibniz. They will bring the ontological argument back in. Okay, and then so Aquinas has many other ideas, a very long and rich thinker, but he is the apotheosis of the schoolmen. And so now I think if we turn to René Descartes, Descartes lives in the 17th century, and he is generally regarded as the father of modern philosophy. He lived from 1596 to 1650. His great creative decade was in the 1640s. I believe it's in 1637 that he publishes the Discourse on Method. And then in the 1640s, I think, 1641, the Meditations on First Philosophy. So now Descartes comes along in opposition to the scholastics, the schoolmen, in opposition to them, and in opposition to all figures of authority whatsoever, and says, what if it were the case that everything I know is false? What if it were the case that everything I think I know was false, that everything I believe, everything I've learned through my intensive studies and education is false? Is there one thing in there of which I can be certain? Is there anything at all that I can start with that I can be absolutely certain about? And he says, well, my doubt is itself certain. I am doubting, and I'm certain that I'm doubting, but in order to doubt, I have to be able to think. So clearly the doubt indicates that I am thinking. So we can start with that as the one indubitably certain thing that I possess. It's my doubt. My very doubt that I exist means that I exist. Otherwise, I wouldn't be there to doubt my existence. So Descartes starts with the famous cogito, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. And this is the invention, really, or the discovery, rather, let's say, of the West's strong subject. The strong self that is contained within the mode of what Heidegger will call Vorhandenheit, which is the realm of being that is proper to self-sufficient entities. And really, in a way, the way Aquinas treated God was to put God in the mode of Vorhandenheit. God was a self-sufficient entity. Here, Descartes trades out that self-sufficient entity, and the ultimate self-sufficient entity now becomes the subject. From Descartes' cogito down to the Kantian transcendental unity of apperception, which is his fancy term for the self, and then down to Heidegger's beginning to dismantle it and embed it back into the ground of being as Dasein. It's the self that's the key here that's being discovered. And the self, now the rationalists all believe, Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza all believe in innate ideas, that we are born with certain ideas which are innate to us, such as the idea of God, let's say, or the truths of mathematics, or the truths of logic. These are ideas that we come equipped with at birth, and that is what distinguishes the so-called rationalists from the empiricists, who are all British. Berkeley was Irish, but they're all English-speaking, who deny that we have any innate ideas. For John Locke, the mind is a tabula rasa. It's a blank slate. We come to experience with a blank slate, and all our ideas are derived from the senses for John Locke. Not so for Descartes. Note, though, that with Aquinas, though Aquinas had said that there are no innate ideas, that all of our ideas have been derived, since universals, a la Aristotle, universals are embedded in the physical world. They are not transcendent to it, like with Plato. They're embedded in it, and therefore that's where we get our ideas. But God, on the other hand, contains lots of innate ideas. God, all kinds of innate ideas are contained in the mind of God. So in a way, Descartes has transposed Aquinas' idea of God, and now the subject becomes the God, as it were, the front row centerpiece of philosophy that now needs to be worked through and resolved. And at the same time, in the development of painting, the portrait study, and you can see it here with Descartes, the portrait study of the metaphysically unique individual, which is the Faustian conception of the human individual as a metaphysical species unto himself, has already been discovered in painting since about 1500, since Jan van Eyck and Giovanni Bellini start painting real, actual, three-dimensional human beings in place of saints and in place of portraits of Christ. And so this is the age of the discovery of the self with Descartes. So I think, therefore, I am. Then he moves on to prove God's existence by saying, now, it could be the case that the outer world of the senses is kind of like a dream. It might not be real. I might just think that it's real. After all, when I'm in a dream, the dream world that I'm in, I believe that to be real while I'm in it. So why not have the same doubts about my sensory experiences? And he says, but that would cast God into the role of a deceiver, almost like a Gnostic archon. God would be a deceiver, and God is the perfect being, than whom none greater can be conceived. Plus, God's an innate idea as well. So he proves God's existence through kind of resurrecting the Onological argument, which had said that God exists by definition, because existence is a perfection and God contains all perfections. So God is the perfect being for Descartes, the one being, and who cannot deceive me because he's a perfect being. He doesn't contain imperfections such as the devil does, like with deception. So we know that God exists, and we know I exist, we know I think, we know God exists, and then he proceeds to a proof of the physical world, which there again is that all the sensory data that comes to me about the world of the senses cannot be faulty. The senses can deceive, but God does not. And so the external world is real as well. So he sort of founds a science of philosophy using the geometrical method. Geometry is all the rage during the 17th century. Using the geometrical method, he sort of founds a new science, as it were, almost, of philosophy, in which ideas are held to be clear and distinct. And now note that, because another one of the main conceits of the 17th century is that this is the age of optics. This is the age of the creation of eyeglasses. Spinoza made his living as a lens grinder, and for Descartes, that is true, which is, or indubitably true, which is clear and distinct. And they're not the same thing, clarity and distinction. I can clearly perceive that my arm hurts, let's say. I can clearly perceive that, but I don't distinctly know what the cause is. I don't have a distinct idea of the cause. So for something to be indubitable, it has to be both clear and distinct. And Descartes did have theories of optics as well, and does create the metaphysical phase space, or at least creates its mathematical articulation of it through analytical geometry, where he adds the XYZ axis. Descartes really is the first to put depth perspective, to transfer it from painting and to put it into mathematics with that XYZ axis. But that XYZ axis, in which entities are placed, and in doing so deworlds them, denudes them of their properties of locality, of their secondary qualities, which we'll get to with John Locke. It simply denudes them of everything that makes that object a unique addition to a particular world horizon, gets denuded and put into this Cartesian phase space, which Heidegger calls Vorhandenheit. And he says that the West's understanding of being in the late metaphysical age, he says the metaphysical age extends from Plato to Nietzsche, but this, with Descartes and the discovery of the cogito and his analytical geometry, is the late metaphysical age. And it is the construction of the West's understanding of being as Vorhandenheit, which is to say, the realm of self-sufficient entities. They just sort of float in these mathematical phase spaces, deworlded and denuded of local significance. We want objective properties, primary qualities. We want motion, figure, shape, volume, extension, solidity, rest. That's what the sciences are after, because those are objective properties. And so then we move to Spinoza. Spinoza was a German Jew of Portuguese extraction, living in the Netherlands. And let's see, his dates are 1632 down to 1677. He only lived to be 44 years old. So 1632 to 1677, and he was working on his masterpiece, The Ethics, at the time of his death. I take it that it wasn't quite finished, but it is his main work, and it was published posthumously. He was excommunicated as a Jew, probably for his heresies. And he comes up with a very interesting idea. He's read and studied Descartes. They both lived in the Netherlands, Descartes for a while, even though he was French. The problem of these two different modalities, Descartes is a dualist. So we have the realm of res extensa, which is the realm of bodies, and the realm of res cogitans, which is to say the realm of thought. So we have these two separate substances, thought and extension. And they don't, particularly for Descartes, interact. They wind up being two separate substances that are only reconciled by God and in God. But otherwise, Descartes remains a kind of a dualist between mind and body. The mind it's very important for him that the mind, the soul, is separate from the body because it's immortal. And the body is finitude. It is not immortal. But now Spinoza comes along and says, actually, a way of reconciling this dualism is to say that actually God is the ultimate substance, the ultimate cause of itself, and substance is the ultimate cause of itself, but God is also the ultimate cause of itself. So God actually is the ultimate substance out of which the world, nature, is made. So he says the rather astonishing, although this wouldn't be the least bit surprising to an Indian Hindu philosopher, ends up saying that nature is God. You can't make a distinction between the realm of extension and God. And so this is a radical idea. He's really the first to ever suggest that God, part of God, one of his attributes is extension, is res extensa, the realm of extended things. So my body, insofar as it is extended, is a modality, a modification of the substance of God. My thoughts are another modification. Those occur through time. My body occupies space. But my thoughts are another aspect, another accident, let's say, of the one great substance that is God. So he's retrieving this very old, what Spengler calls Magian idea, and by Magian, Spengler means the Judeo-Christian Islamic culture, where the primary metaphysical dichotomy is between substance and attribute, as it is, let's say, in alchemy, as it is in algebra, as it is in the whole worldview of that civilization in which the powers of light are struggling against the powers of darkness within the world cavern. And he sees Spinoza as a displaced Magian thinker, or a kind of fossil left over from the Magian world, with this idea that the two modes of my being are simply accidents. Thought and extension are simply accidents, not accidents in the sense of the way we understand accidents, but attributes would be a better word. Attributes of the one being or substance who is everything, and that these are the only two attributes, thought and extension, that we can know or predicate of this being. God contains an infinity of attributes as far as Spinoza is concerned, in contrast to Aquinas' note, where Aquinas said, we cannot predicate any attributes of God because God is simple. God is a simple being, not complex. If we predicate attributes to God, then we have to say that God is a complex being, which for Aquinas, he is not. So for Spinoza, though, God contains all attributes, an infinity of attributes, and the only two of them that we know are these two, thought and extension. So this is his way of reconciling the mind-body dualism of Descartes. But note that in doing so, in a way, Spinoza has a very impersonal understanding of the individual. This really is not a Faustian understanding of the individual as a metaphysical species unto himself, since we're all just modalities of God. We're all just modifications of the one substance that is God. And so he really lacks the feel for the individual as a metaphysical entity unto himself, the way Leibniz will come on stage and articulate it with a vengeance. Leibniz is the great articulator of the Faustian idea of individuality within philosophy. It's already been going on for a long time in literature, since the Arthurian romances, and in painting since the discovery of depth perspective in painting and the painting of the subject, starting around the year 1500 in the Renaissance with Jan van Eyck and Giovanni Bellini. So let's take a look then at the empiricist reaction to this, starting with John Locke, 1632 to 1704. And so it's significant that the empiricists now who deny the presence of innate ideas are British. They're British empiricists. That's not at all a surprise. The Brits just simply do not produce great metaphysicians, and cannot produce great metaphysicians unless Alfred North Whitehead be accepted, possibly. But normally they produce empiricists. Even Arnold Toynbee, in opposition to Spengler, takes the empirical approach to the metaphysics of history. And so Locke writes his central work on the understanding, essays concerning the human understanding, or an essay concerning the human understanding, which he wrote in 1667, in which he says now that not only that there are no innate ideas, but he says that we get all of our ideas from the senses. And the outer world, the impressions that we get from the outer world come to us through the senses, through what are called secondary qualities. and secondary qualities. And Locke was not the first to make this distinction. I think Galileo was. But Locke says secondary qualities are totally subjective, such as how something tastes or smells or looks. These are all secondary qualities because they're totally subjective, and they differ from individual to individual. One individual thinks quiche is great, let's say. Another individual thinks it's disgusting. So secondary qualities are entirely dependent on the subject. But they inhere, as it were, in primary qualities. And primary qualities are the real reality that is out there that science is interested in. Motion and rest, extension, figure, shape, solidity, all of those basic structural features are the primary qualities that the secondary qualities inhere in, as it were. We can say that they inhere in those. So then Locke wonders, well, what is it then that's upholding the primary qualities? What do they inhere in? And for him, he says substance. So in a way, he borrows Spinoza's idea of substance, but he secularizes it. Substance then becomes for Locke this sort of metaphysical whatness, we know not what. The quidditas of substance is unknown to us. We just know that it's there, according to Locke. It's out there, and primary qualities depend on it, and secondary qualities depend on the primary qualities, and that's where we get our ideas. They come in through the senses, and so we get this. Locke does believe in God. He admits in belief of God, yet God does not figure in his philosophy at all in any essential way whatsoever, and I think he's the first of these thinkers where that is the case, that God simply is not important to his very secularized cosmology here. Not so with Bishop Berkeley, who was, after all, a bishop and an Anglo-Irish philosopher who lived 1685 to 1753 and publishes in 1713 an important text called A Dialogue between Hylus and Philanus. Hylus meaning matter, of course, and Philanus meaning the lover of the mind. So Berkeley comes along with a thorough belief in God, comes along and says, you know what, even the external world is not real. It's sort of like the Indian idea of Maya, that the external world is not real. It's a kind of a trick. The world is not made up of physical things, of primary qualities inhering in substances. The world is made up of minds and spirits perceiving things. So for Berkeley, the essential thing is to be, for something to be, is for it to be perceived. So the answer to that old philosophical cliche, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one around to hear it, is it real? Berkeley would say, no, it's not real. If there's no one around to hear it, it doesn't exist. For something to be, it has to be perceived. It's absolutely essential. So he says, yeah, the secondary qualities, as Locke pointed out, are fundamentally subjective. That much is very true. If you take a person who has his hand, let's say he has his left hand dipped in hot water and his right hand dipped in cold water, and he plunges both into a bowl of warm water, the two hands are going to feel two temperature differences. So which is it? What is the actual temperature of that water? And so, of course, that's when we bring in the thermometer and we get the primary qualities that science studies that are not subjective at all. But now the problem with primary qualities, according to Berkeley, is that really even primary qualities are subjective. I can say that tree over there is large, looks large, but as I walk toward it, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So exactly how large is it? Because when I walk away from it, then it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So much for the primary objectivity of the primary quality of extension, of figure, shape, motion. He says, to a flea, my foot is gigantic, but not to me. To me, it's a foot. It's the size of a foot. Nothing gigantic about it. And so he gets into this idea of the relativity of perception of even primary qualities, things that science hangs its coat on. Even those cannot be regarded as something objective. And so, lacking then Locke's substance, because of course it's secular, and Spinoza's idea of substance as God, And Descartes' idea of a dual substance, a substance of the mind and a substance of the body, lacking all of that, then, what is it that in the external world upholds these perceptions for me so that I can perceive things? And that is, of course, God. God is the being whose perception organizes and maintains the outer world for me, so that what I'm seeing I know to be real and objective. So that's how Berkeley resolves this, and he denies innate ideas. He believes that all of our knowledge comes to us through the senses, so he denies them. Now let's turn to the maestro. I think that he's the most brilliant of all of these individuals and has the most to say, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who was born in 1646, and dies, I think, in 1716. 1716. 2 years after writing his masterpiece, the Monodology, which is actually very short but incredibly dense. Leibniz was just an all-around universal genius. He is the inventor or co-inventor of infinitesimal calculus, although he invented it entirely independently from Newton. That often happens. The theory of evolution was a co-discovery of Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. Darwin gets the credit. In this case, you could say that Newton gets the credit, but not really. So anybody who knows anything about mathematics knows that these two co-invented the calculus simply because the age was ready for it. The infinitesimal calculus. That's the finding of the infinite. That is the application of depth perspective and the vanishing point from depth perspective into mathematics. So the age was just simply ready for it. I love the 17th century. It's art, its culture, its thought, all of it is absolutely amazing. So now, with Leibniz, we have to start with his distinction. Leibniz was very fond of logic, and we have to start with this distinction that he makes between truths of reason and truths of fact. So we have truths of reason, and this is the first time, and this will carry over into Kant, where he becomes interested in the relation of the predicate to the subject. So in analytically true statements, and all truths of reason are analytically true, the predicate is contained by definition in the subject. And so they have to be true in accords with the principle of non-contradiction. So these are all the truths of mathematics, the truths of logic. When we say A is A, or A is equal to A, we cannot make a contradiction to that. We can't say A is equal to A, but also equal to not A. In accordance with the principle of contradiction, that's not true. So analytically true statements are true a priori. The predicate is contained in the subject, and these are the truths of mathematics. And they don't make assertions, as truths of fact do, about existence, with one exception, and that is the ontological proof of God's existence. That God exists is an analytically true statement because it's a priori. It's also an innate idea. Leibniz goes back to the idea that we do possess innate ideas, and one of those is the idea of God. And so we have truths of fact, which are statements that are contingent, and they are true in accordance with the principle of sufficient reason, which we'll encounter again with Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer's first book is on the fourfold, or it might be his second, on the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason, whereby when we say that something in the outer world is true, there must be a sufficient reason for why it's true. That this person is here or exists, there must be a sufficient reason for that, namely his parents, his or her parents, and so forth. There's a sufficient reason for everything. In other words, causality. Everything has a cause, but it has to be a sufficient reason. And so truths of fact are statements based on contingency, and they make statements based on existence. They are existential. Existential ideas can be asserted with truths of fact, which are always true a posteriori then. They are true after experience. So you can already see Leibniz setting up the stage here for Immanuel Kant, who will come along and take this and run with it. And then we have this very important principle of the identity of indiscernibles, where Leibniz says it cannot be the case that two substances are absolutely identical in every respect. If you take two substances and they have all the same qualities and they're absolutely identical, then you have the same substance. They're not two different substances. They are the same substance, which is one of the reasons why Leibniz rejected atomism, the theory of atoms, because all the atoms once you get down to the level of the atoms of Democritus and Epicurus and so forth, down to that level, all the atoms are the same. Some of them might have different shapes and so forth, but they're all the same, which for Leibniz would be an absolute absurdity, because as far as he was concerned, nothing exists that is not different, no matter how infinitesimal the difference is, from something else. Otherwise, by that principle of the identity of indiscernibles, it would cancel out, and we would have the same substance. So even if we had, like, I suppose with the case of twins, Leibniz would say there are plenty of differences between these twins, both psychologically and probably physically as well. But there are always differences, and for Leibniz, the differences really do lie within. And so this gets into his Monodology, which is a short text that he writes a couple of years before his death in 1714, where he says that actually, and this is how he handles the substance idea, actually everything is made up out of these things he calls monads. This is his version, the German response, let's say, to atomism. Everything is made up out of these spiritual units that are not extended. They do not have the property of extension, because physical matter has that. And these are spiritual units, these monads. And there's an infinity of them, possibly. We don't know for sure. But there's a number of them that's certainly greater than any number that we could give to them. And physical bodies are aggregates of monads. A human body is ruled by a certain central monad, which is its soul, and the body itself is made up out of this cooperation of all of these other monads. These monads are windowless in the sense that you cannot see into them. They're impenetrable, and each one of them in a certain sense is alive, because they all have a degree of perception. They all perceive the outer world, and they reflect it. They're windowless, but they're shining. They reflect the entirety of the universe, and they're non. It's hard to imagine how points that are not extended can aggregate together to form physical matter, and that is a problem with Leibniz that he really does not successfully solve. But so we have monads at the level of matter. We have monads that have very dim perception of the outer world, a dim sort of confused perception, these merely perceiving monads that make up matter, the material world. But then we get monads who do have a certain degree of consciousness, a certain degree of perceptiveness, as with plants. A plant has a heliotropic consciousness. It knows where to put itself in relation to the sun so that it can get to the sun and use the sun as its basic energy. It does have a certain degree of perceptiveness that matter doesn't have, but nonetheless it still exists in a kind of dim, foggy, confused state, almost like a slumber. And indeed, plants do correspond to a kind of deep, dreamless, sleeping consciousness. But he says, now, if you add memory and feeling to the perceptiveness of plants, then you get the consciousness of an animal, because an animal remembers that you hit it with that stick, and it remembers that, and it wanders off in a direction opposite to the stick, because it has memory, and it feels pain if you hit it with that stick. And so with animal consciousness, we have a higher monad that can perceive the external world much more clearly. But now if you add apperception, so we have apperceptive monads, which are basically human, and these are monads that are aware of their perceptions. They're not only perceiving the outer world, they're aware that they are perceiving the outer world. And so these are not merely perceiving monads or monads with memory and feeling. These are monads that know that they perceive the outer world and can analyze it and can arrive at truths about the outer world, especially because there are plenty of innate truths within such monads, such as the existence of God, that the being comes equipped with that can be analyzed out. It isn't as though Leibniz says with innate ideas that you have an infant that has all of these ideas that it immediately has access to, like that the three angles of a triangle have to add up to 180 degrees. That's an innate idea that Descartes would agree with, that is guaranteed by the reality of God. God guarantees, God is the ultimate sufficient reason for that truth. But it can be arrived at later on, like in Plato with Socrates teasing out of the slave, who is apparently ignorant, a mathematical problem that he solves with Socrates' help, because it's in him. Mathematics are truths that are within us, and that is true for Leibniz just as it is true for Descartes, and also Spinoza. And so that's a brief introduction to Leibniz. There's a lot more in Leibniz. He's just absolutely brilliant. And his idea of monads should be contrasted with Spinoza's idea that each of us is a modification of the one substance of God in a way that kind of makes all of us generic. Not so with Leibniz, because he says each monad, in accordance with the principle of the identity of indiscernibles, is different. No two monads are the same, no matter how infinitesimal the differences are amongst like monads that I suppose compose matter. Nonetheless, they are all different. And not only that, they are composed of a sort of active force and a passive force. And the passive force has two elements to it. There's simply the passive force of its inertial existence, but then there's also the passive force of matter, of mass, of materiality. But the monad has consciousness, so it has an active force that resists that mass and moves against it. And so he has translated, I think what Spengler would say, is the primary metaphysical opposition of Faustian civilization, namely force-moving mass, whereas we had seen with Spinoza via the Magian Judeo-Christian Islamic civilization, the primary metaphysical dichotomy there was substance-accident or substance-attribute, whereas with the Greeks the primary dichotomy had been form and matter, as it was with Aristotle, which Aquinas inherited from Aristotle and said that the world is basically hylomorphic, that is to say, is made up of form and matter. The world is a substance. The substance problem for Aquinas wasn't a problem. The world is simply made up out of form and matter is simply pure potentiality and the pure receptivity for the imprint of form upon it, which then actualizes potentialities into actualities, form and matter. Okay, so then let's take a look at David Hume to conclude here. He's a bit later than these other thinkers. Not a mathematician at all. And let's see, his dates here are, looks like 1711 to 1776. And his important text is the Treatise of Human Nature of 1739, 1740, especially book one of that treatise. He died at the age of 65 in 1776, which I don't think anybody would care much about. And frankly, I find David Hume to be boring. He looks snarky to me in the portraits of him. Doesn't look like a very pleasant chap. His analysis of causality, and this is one of the key entrees into Immanuel Kant, is that he says there's a fundamental irrationality about causality when scientists say that A causes B necessarily. So there's a necessary relation between A and B that makes it true scientifically and objectively. And so the sciences proceed with this idea that there's a cause, what Leibniz would have called the principle of sufficient reason, that every single thing has a cause and that the cause is necessary. And Hume says, well, what's the basis of this necessity, actually? Let's suppose I have a pencil in my hand and I let go of the pencil and it falls. Now I can say what caused the pencil to fall out of my hand was the fact that I let go of it, but we don't see anything necessary. Where's the glue? The necessary glue that connects the predicate, the pencil fell, with the subject, my hand holding the pencil. The subject and predicate don't seem to have any kind of necessary connection there. There's really no glue holding them together other than habit. Simply because we've seen the same thing happen over and over, and this is, of course, Hume's empiricism. He also denies innate ideas. The British are all pretty shallow. And so we have causality based on habit. We say the sun is going to rise tomorrow simply because we've seen it rise every day. We've seen it rise. This totally ignores the fact that we know exactly what causes the sun to rise, the Earth's rotation on its axis. But humans say even that does not have any necessity about it. There is no necessity. And so for him, causality becomes a problem if it is really based on habit, and then we just say something, A caused B, because we've seen it happen a million times before. We know that thunder that we just heard was caused by the lightning, because we've observed a million times past that lightning causes thunder. Sound doesn't move as fast as light. That's intuitively demonstrable, and we know that. So it's just habit. We can say lightning causes thunder, but not with anything not that there should be any kind of objective necessity about it that would lay a basis for the study and deworlding of these phenomena in the sciences by putting them inside of this Cartesian phase space of Vorhandenheit, what Heidegger would call Vorhandenheit, which is what all of these guys are basically articulating, all seven of these thinkers, with the exception of Aquinas, who's in a different world. He's got God inside of Vorhandenheit. So it's a different world. These other six, though, are all products of the 17th century and Hume of the 18th. And Immanuel. So this is the setup that Immanuel Kant inherits. This debate between rationalists and empiricists regarding innate ideas. Do we come equipped with innate ideas, such as the truths of mathematics and the idea of God? Can we have a science of metaphysics based on such ideas? Or is it the case, as the empiricists say, that all our knowledge comes to us through the senses, and we abstract universals from comparison and contrast we extract the universal of the horse, let's say, by looking at through the course of our lifetime at all the different horses. So then we have the idea of horse as an intelligible species, as Aquinas would call it. We just simply abstract it from the phenomena. Or is it the case that the mind comes equipped with certain truths, such as the truths of mathematics, which cannot be demonstrated or pulled out of experience, but which make experience possible? And so that's what, when we get to Immanuel Kant, and here he is, 1724 to 1804, and he's the first of our great German idealist thinkers, although I think to a certain degree you could say that Leibniz was also a German idealist thinker. And he writes the first version of the Critique of Pure Reason in 1781. And he follows it. He's got a Critique of Practical Reason in 1788, which has to do with the study of morality, and the Critique of Judgment in 1790, which has to do with aesthetics and also with teleology. But the bomb is really the Critique of Pure Reason, 1781. That is the bomb. That is his best book, and it is one of the greatest works of philosophy ever written. So we'll look at the Critique of Pure Reason and how Immanuel Kant attempted, anyway, to solve this problem between the rationalists and the empiricists. And while doing so, I think, ended one epoch of philosophy that goes back to Descartes, but simultaneously inaugurates a new one, namely the great period of German idealist philosophy that cycles through Fichte and Schelling and Hegel and is terminated and concluded by Schopenhauer. So we'll look at Immanuel Kant next time.